Today's Bible notes come from Matthew chapter 2. In Matthew chapter 1, we have the genealogy of Jesus and the virgin birth of Jesus, with a focus on Joseph's perspective. Joseph's perspective somewhat continues in chapter 2. Matthew 1 and 2 is unique, material unique to Matthew, and it's a little different from the birth material we have in Luke 1 and 2. In Luke 2, we have a focus on the lowliness of Jesus' birth, the humility of Jesus' birth. This fits with Luke's theme that Jesus ministered to the marginalized and those who were on the outcast of ancient society. Matthew 2 has a much different focus. Matthew focuses on the kingliness of Jesus, the royalness of Jesus, and I believe also that Matthew chapter 2 wants us to see images of Moses here, wants us to think of Jesus as the new Moses, as the Moses 2.0, as the fulfilled Moses, as it were. Moses was at times thought of as a royal figure in some corners of Judaism. There might be a connection there. But let's look a little bit at Matthew chapter 2, Jesus in his royalty and Jesus in his being a Moses-like figure. First of all, as a Moses-like figure, you can see the parallels between the birth story of Moses and the birth story of Jesus. So the birth story of Moses, you had a king, Pharaoh, who tried to kill the Israelite babies. Herod tries to kill babies. He does kill babies. Pharaoh killed babies. Moses escaped by God's intervention. Jesus escapes by God's intervention. And so you have that parallel between Jesus and Moses that is, I think, implicit in Matthew chapter 2. You also have the royal emphasis here. You have a king, Herod the Great, who is threatened by Jesus and sees Jesus as a potential usurper of his throne. Well, this we don't have any historical evidence outside of Matthew of Herod killing the babies in Bethlehem. However, it does fit with the personality of Herod as it is depicted in Josephus and others. So, for example, Herod had 2 of his sons and his wife put to death because he was paranoid that they were plotting to overthrow him. And let's face it, they probably were. But the idea that Herod would kill a lot of babies trying to kill somebody who threatened his kingship, that does fit with the personality of Herod as is revealed in the historical sources we have. The wise men come from the east. Who are these wise men? Who are these magi? Well, they are stargazers. We could probably call them astrologers of a sort. They're probably not Jews. They're probably non-Jews or Gentiles. And so even though Matthew is the most Jewish-focused gospel, we have even in Matthew this sense that Gentiles will come to believe upon Jesus. Of course, in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, go into all the world, go and make disciples of every nation. And so we have an anticipation. This is the first anticipation in Matthew that the gospel might be just for non-Jews as well as Jews, in the fact that these magi, these wise men, come looking for Jesus. They follow a star. Some have said, is this a comet? Is this a supernova? Frankly, I don't know how you're going to follow a comet to Jerusalem. A lot of Jewish literature thinks of stars as heavenly beings, and so I think probably we should see this star as some kind of an angel or some kind of a heavenly being that's leading the way, maybe. Can't prove it. And so the wise men come to Herod, of course. Herod is alarmed that there would be some other king that is somewhere around. He consults to find, where the child is born. The wise men come, they fall to their knees and honor Jesus. Some versions say worshipped him. It's a little ambiguous because the word here is proskuneo. You do that before a king, you bow before a king. But of course we worship Jesus. They offer him the kinds of gifts that you would give to a king. And of course, Herod finally realizes that they've gone home a different way, and he kills all the babies under 2 years of age, down here in verse 16. This suggests that Jesus was over a year old before Joseph and Mary left Bethlehem. We have to remember that the Christmas plays we see in church are a splicing together of Matthew and Luke. It was not in the nature of ancient history or biography to feel like they had to harmonize things. I'm not going to suggest what the harmonized version of Matthew and Luke might be. I will only say this, that if we did not have Luke, if we knew nothing about Luke, and were strictly listening to Matthew 2, we would assume that Joseph and Mary were originally from Bethlehem, and that they only left Bethlehem because Herod the Great was going to kill these babies, and that they would have returned and lived forever in Bethlehem if it were not for Herod's son Archelaus, mentioned down here in verse 22, that they probably would have gone back to Bethlehem. That's what we would assume if we did not have Luke. That's just the way Matthew would read. Now, of course, Luke suggests that Joseph and Mary were actually from Nazareth, and that they only went to Bethlehem because of a census. So this is a slight tension between the story in Matthew and the story in Luke, and I'm not going to try to resolve those questions. I'll simply say that it is worthwhile at least to listen to the themes of Matthew and Luke, each on their own terms, before we do the Christmas play kind of thing. Of course, the scriptures, we mentioned in Matthew 1 that one of the themes of Matthew is the fulfillment of prophecy, but I think it really comes home that if you go back and look at these verses, so we have Hosea 11:1 here in verse 15, and we have a verse from Jeremiah 31 down here. I grew up thinking that if I were to go back to these scriptures, I would find a prediction. But that's not what you find. If you go back to Hosea, if you go back to Jeremiah, you don't find predictions of events in the life of Jesus. What is actually going on here is Matthew is reading the Old Testament with spiritual glasses on, and he is seeing things that Hosea and Jeremiah never could have imagined. He is reading the Old Testament in a fuller sense. This is not a problem. This is not an error. Matthew is not an error. He's a good Pentecostal. He's not in error, and the problem is with my assumptions. The problem is with my expectations. I went through a kind of a faith crisis in seminary when I finally realized that this verse is not. If you go back to Hosea 11:1, it doesn't say, "And in days to come, the Messiah will go down to Egypt, and then out of Egypt I will call my son." That's not what Hosea 11:1 says. Hosea 11:1 says that when Israel, it's not even talking about Jesus, when Israel was a child, I called my son out of Egypt, Israel. But the more I called after my son, the more he served other gods. He served Baals and Ashtaroths. Well, Jesus never did that. And so you see, Hosea is not even making a prediction about the future. Hosea is talking about something that had happened way in the past, even in Hosea's day. He's talking about the Exodus. And so is this a problem? No, it's not a problem at all. It does suggest that a lot of the stuff that you hear out there about how this stuff works isn't really how it works. Matthew, especially Matthew, is reading the Old Testament in a fuller sense, in a sensus plenior, in a spiritual way. He's inspired. He's allowed to do that. And so he is seeing extra meanings to these words that are not meanings that Hosea had in mind, or in this case, Jeremiah had in mind. This passage down here in verse 18, in context, was about the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 BC. It was not a prediction about something that would happen in Bethlehem. This is not a problem. This is not an error. What is an error is the assumptions that we have. But in any case, we end the chapter with, again, Joseph in a dream. Notice Joseph had a dream in chapter 1. Joseph has a dream in chapter 2. Matthew focuses on Joseph's perspective and on his dreams and on dreams. We'll have angel Gabriel visiting Mary in, of course, Luke 1 and 2. So we have the birth story of the childhood of Jesus in Matthew chapter 2. This last part is interesting. Because of Archelaus, they go to Nazareth, and that the prophecy might be fulfilled. He'll be called a Nazarene. This is where the Nazarene church gets its name. This is especially verse 22 is a sign of how Matthew is inspired but he's seeing spiritual meanings. We can't even find what verse he's talking about here. This is such a spiritual interpretation of the Old Testament that Matthew seems to be triangulating possibly more than one verse. The closest verse to this in the Old Testament is in Isaiah 11:1, which talks about a branch coming. And the word for branch in Hebrew is Natsir. Natsir, Nazareth, we don't know of any historical connection between the village of Nazareth and a branch, but Matthew, with spiritual eyes, sees an anticipation of the branch of Isaiah, sees in Nazareth an anticipation of the village of Nazareth in the branch of Isaiah 11:1. So as you can see, it's a different world than maybe you imagined when you begin to read Matthew chapter 2 in its original context. Well, Matthew 2 for today.